Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released their latest report. Some of you may have seen it. The findings were pretty stark. It said we still do have time to avoid the very worst impacts of climate change, but we must act now. Acting now on climate change. What does that look like? How many of you, as directors and CEOs of council organisations, feel confident that you know what acting now on climate change looks like? What does that look like for you in your role as a leader? What does that look like for your team? And what does that look like for your organisation? You wouldn't be alone in feeling both inspired by the challenge but also a little overwhelmed. And you're in luck because that is exactly what this workshop is all about. How do we take decisive action on climate change and make it meaningful? My name is Keath. I'm a climate strategist at City of Onkparinga, and it is my absolute pleasure to be your MC for the day. I first began working in climate change in 2012, and in that year I was lucky enough to attend a conference on climate change. And at the conference there were lots of people like me, environmental policy professionals from state and local government, consultants, scientists, who were all working with communities to develop climate change adaptation plans. And the conversation that year was all about, all right, which IPCC emissions pathway should we use? Are we going to do high emissions, low emissions, middling emissions? And how on earth do we even plan for an uncertain future climate? So there was a lot of conversation around pathways planning. I attended the same conference this year, and I was stunned by the change in both the content and also the people that were at the conference. So they're all the same people as 2012, but this year there was a very new, sizable and visible cohort of lawyers, bankers, insurance industry professionals, and perhaps concerningly, Defence Force personnel, who were all really interested in managing climate change. And the conversation this year was all about the fact that climate change is happening. It's happening here and it's happening now. It's having significant adverse impacts on our communities, our infrastructure and our assets, and our economy. And for all the reasons that our panel are going to outline for you today, it became really clear that if councils want to avoid significant financial risk, legal liabilities, and reputational damage, we need to put in place some strong governance, corporate governance, around managing our climate risk. So now, when we take on a new project at council, we're going to have to answer all the usual questions. What does the community think? Is it politically palatable? Does it align with our strategic plan? Can we fund it? Is it feasible? And then we're going to have to add one more question. Have we factored in climate risk? So to help us understand exactly why and how we need to do that, we have brought together an internationally recognised and highly skilled panel of experts, Sarah Barker, Mark Siebentritt, Donovan Burton and John Nairn. And before I hand over to them, I have some very quick housekeeping and acknowledgements, and then we'll get to the good stuff. So this event has been jointly organised by Resilient South and Resilient Hills of Coast, which are two regional groupings of councils on our beautiful peninsula and in the hills. And they have worked together for many years to get on the front foot with climate change. And I really want to acknowledge the support of the committee members in organising this event today. In particular, I'd like to thank Jen St. Jack, who's up the back, who organised this event with me today. Jen's going to be our timekeeper, so panellists take note. Sarah Barker has 25 minutes, Mark and John have 10 minutes, and Donovan has 15 minutes. And while they're speaking, you're going to be served a delicious breakfast. If you need them, the toilets are just through this door here. And we'll finish up by 9:30, when you can stick around for more conversation. And your briefing is going to be followed by a staff workshop, and they're going to hear all the same information as you, but they're going to have an added extra where they're going to do a facilitated workshop where they get to answer, what are we already doing to manage our financial and legal risks within councils? What are we doing well? What are the barriers to doing better? And what are some strategies that we can put in place in our organisations to harness our opportunities? And there are opportunities. It sounds all doom and gloom, risk management, but there are opportunities if we get on the front foot with this stuff. And so I really encourage you to frame your thinking around opportunities today. And we'll share the results of that session with you. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sarah Barker to the stage. Sarah is a special counsel at Minter Ellison, and she's commonly referred to in climate circles as the rock star of climate-related corporate risk governance. Did you know that, Sarah? A corporate lawyer by trade, she's a global expert in climate change-related exposures under corporate and securities law, and that's opposed to environmental law, including directors' fiduciary duties and financial disclosure obligations. If you recognise Sarah's name, it's because she's been getting a lot of media lately. Sarah is an experienced director. She's currently a board member of Responsible Investment Association Australasia and one of Australia's largest superannuation funds. She's taught the Australian Institute of Company Directors, EMCEE, for more than a decade. Sarah's international work with institutions like the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority, the United Nations PRI and the European Union allows her to provide practical, progressive advice to listed corporations, investors and government in Australia. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Barker.
Well, I have the very significant role this morning of outlining for you what climate change is and why it's important for councils. And as we go through, you will get the sense that because I'm a corporate lawyer, I've been a corporate lawyer for 20 years, I don't care about the environment or the community. I care about money and I care about risk. And that's the lens that I bring to looking at climate change for all governments, be they national, state or local. Now, can we get the slides up? There was a big, thick report by the Bank of England Prudential Regulation Authority that sat under that about the financial implications of climate change. They talk about climate change in three categories. So first of all, the physical or ecological risks associated with climate change. These are the ones that we usually think of straight away when we discuss climate change. And I'll go through what they actually are. But then another two categories of risk that might not immediately come to mind. Economic transition risks associated with climate change, which is basically the response of markets, be they commercial or financial, to the threats associated with climate change. And then finally, my favourite topic, liability consequences associated with climate change. And as we go through and interrogate each of these categories of risk, you will see that these are not issues that can be deferred in their consideration to 2100 or 2070, 2030 or even 2020. They are relevant now, in the short term, and very much within mainstream investment horizons. So to start with, let's do a little bit of environmental stuff, get that out of the way, as we talk through what are the physical or ecological risks associated with climate change. And I've got that up there on the slide, a picture of the report that Nina referred to from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the peak grouping of scientists convened by the United Nations to assess the implications on climate change. And the other picture on the right there, I've got the summary for policymakers. So even if you don't have time to read through a report that's a couple of pages long, they get that. And they've done a very much shorter, although still not an easy read, it's still quite technical, summary that I would commend to you. So, Climate Change 101. What is it? Well, you might have heard of, still not, there we go, the greenhouse effect of climate change. And the reason for that is this. The Earth has an atmosphere, Everyone with me so far? Yes, there's an atmosphere. Within that atmosphere, we have a layer of what is called greenhouse gas. It's a layer of gas that comprises 6 different kinds, primarily, of gas from carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and it occurs naturally in our atmosphere. We need that layer of gas to keep our planet warm at the temperature that we humans can live within. So if we didn't have this layer of greenhouse gas, the temperature of the Earth would be more akin to that of Mars. The issue with climate change is that mankind is making that layer of gas get thicker and thicker and thicker. Because since the Industrial Revolution, what we've done is dug up fossil fuels like coal and oil and gas and combusted them, turned them from, say, solid form into gas, and dumped a whole stack of excess of these greenhouse gases above and beyond what natural processes would have done into the atmosphere. And at the same time, we've done things like clear forests, which are natural sequesters or natural sinks for these kinds of gases. So we've debilitated the ability of the planet to self-regulate the emission of these gases at the same time as we've been dumping all this excess. And a bit like in winter when it's cold at night and you put a thicker blanket on, as this layer of gas has been getting thicker and thicker and thicker, so too the temperature of the Earth has been getting warmer and warmer and warmer. Now, you might think, well, isn't this going to be a problem down the track? Well, no, it's already a problem. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the concentration or the thickness of that layer of gas was measured at 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. We're already up over 405 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that translates to a global average temperature increase of about 1.1 degrees centigrade, which in and of itself is pretty bad, and I'll talk about why. But if we keep going the way we're going, by the end of the century, we're looking at global average temperatures in excess of 4 degrees centigrade above global averages. Who says so? Not just Sarah with her Year 10 biology, last time I did science, but those pointy heads with multiple PhDs who do know a lot about atmospheric science are telling us this, as is CSIRO, as is NASA, as is the World Meteorological Organisation. The degree of scientific certainty that they attribute to climate change is the physical science degree of certainty. So they are as certain as they are in relation to gravity, in relation to climate change. Why do we care about these temperature increases? Well, there are gradual onset implications that occur over time, that occur over decadal timescales and get worse and worse as time goes on. So things like sea level rise, which is caused by, as it gets warmer, ice sheets melt, essentially, and all that fresh water raises the level of the sea. Rainfall variation, so dry areas generally get drier, wet areas get wetter, and the distribution of the rainfall changes. And of course that increase in average temperatures. Catastrophic extreme weather events. So even now, due to that 1.1 degree centigrade of global warming, we are seeing an increase in the frequency and extremity of extreme weather events that are directly attributable to climate change, from bushfires and high wind events in South Australia, not that you know anything about high wind events in South Australia, and cyclones. The Gold Coast is now well and truly within the cyclone zone in Queensland as a result of climate change. And ecological impacts like mass extinctions of flora and fauna, biodiversity loss, freshwater loss. How bad, where and when? That we don't know. The IPCC's report last week was quite significant in that it compared, well, what are the ecological implications going to be if we manage to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages, over and above, or less than if we limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade above for industrial averages. And even then, the difference is quite stark. Little things like if we limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, we'll only lose between 70 and 90% of the Great Barrier Reef, versus at 2 degrees we lose 99% of the Great Barrier Reef. And then when we get anything up above 2 degrees, the ecology of the Earth basically breaks down, and it almost doesn't matter. We lose up to 95% of terrestrial and marine species. Agriculture will only be possible at the poles. There will be no winery industry here because at an average global temperature increase of 4 degrees centigrade, at the mid-latitudes where we are in South Australia and Victoria, the temperature increases are between 2 and 3 times that global average. So we're looking at an average temperature increase on the land in South Australia, and Donovan and John will be able to provide more detail around this, at a 4 degrees centigrade average, upwards of 10 or 12 degrees centigrade. So those 42 degree days, that's June. Not only that, melting of the Greenland ice sheet, we've got sea level rise in excess of 7 metres, it goes on and on and on and on. It sounds pretty alarmist and catastrophic. That's because it's pretty alarmist and catastrophic. So you can see there in the grey area at the top, that's the trajectory of emissions that the global economy is currently on, under business as usual. The purple bit is where the Paris Agreement comes into play. If all the countries around the world comply with the Paris Agreement commitments, will be in the purple bit. But it's the light green bit down the bottom that we need to get to in order to prevent ecological collapse of the planet. Now, that's all I'm going to do in terms of talking about the environment. But the necessity to shift the global economy from a trajectory that's in that top grey area to that light green area requires a huge decarbonisation of the entire way the planet goes about business. And that creates what we call economic transition risks. So these are the responses of the market to the threats associated with climate change and the imperative to decarbonise the economy. Net zero by 2050, that's only 32 years away. And if you think, even just this morning, everything that your day so far has involved emission of fossil fuels. Whether it's driving your car, eating some kind of meat product for breakfast, brushing your teeth with a plastic toothbrush. It's pervasive. Huge change required. So what are these economic transition risks associated with climate change? Again, very helpfully, the Bank of England has given us 3 categories of those risks. First of all, policy and regulatory responses to climate change, like the carbon tax that we had federally and then didn't have. Like the Paris Agreement. What is the Paris Agreement? Because it's bandied around a lot, but people aren't really quite sure what it means. Basically, this was an agreement between 196 countries across the world, recognising the absolute criticality of limiting global warming to no more than and well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial averages. And it contains a mechanism whereby every year countries around the world, or every 5 years, countries around the world have to bring to the table their own unique commitments to reduce emissions in line with that ultimate goal of minimising global warming. And within the Paris Agreement, there is also a provision whereby the countries have agreed that in the second half of the century, the global economy will be operating on a net zero emissions basis. Technological responses to climate change. So these are natural responses of a capitalist market to economic risks and opportunities. Technological development, innovation, like all the wonderful renewables and the Tesla battery that you've got here in South Australia, like electric vehicles. These are not lefty hippie granny things. These are hard-nosed people looking to make a buck, who are responding to the opportunity and innovating with the opportunities associated with climate change. And finally, shifting stakeholder preferences in relation to these issues and market stakeholder expectations. I've been blown away by the change in public attitude towards single-use plastics, even just in the last 6 months. All of a sudden, everyone's getting rid of plastic straws and plastic bags at the supermarkets. It's just been quite extraordinary. If we look at both ends of the stakeholder spectrum for you've got the community. Within 5 years, more than 60% of voting age people are going to be millennial. And I don't know if any of you have tried to hire a millennial lately. Oh my God. It's all about the values and making sure that the values of who they interact with, purchase from, work for, is consistent with their own personal values. And sustainability is a 101 for them. They start getting taught about recycling and pollution in kindergarten. It's not new. At the other end of the spectrum, we have what I call the old crusties, and I'm allowed to say that because I am one of them, which are investors and market stakeholders who are increasingly concerned about the material economic risks for their portfolios associated with climate change. So we have the regulators of markets in Australia, APRA, ASIC and the ASX, coming out and saying, oh geez, this is a material financial risk that needs to be managed. We have the World Economic Forum, that group of left-granny socialist hippies of the CEOs of the 1,000 largest corporations in the world that meet at a 7-star resort in Davos in Switzerland every January, saying this is the top economic concern, a failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. If you look down that list on the right, every single one of those risks is associated with climate change. You might say, oh, Sarah, weapons of mass destruction, that's a Trump, Kim Jong-un thing. That has nothing to do with climate change. Departments of Defence are so concerned about climate change because they understand that drought is a direct cause of conflict. And not only that, they are at the front lines picking up the pieces for the millions of climate refugees. There will be 300 million in our Asia-Pacific region, with our neighbours underwater in 2100, if we have business as usual on emissions. Which is number 4 there, large-scale involuntary migration. My God, if the world is having trouble with a couple of million refugees from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan at the moment, what's it going to be like in 2100 when there is no fresh water source in the Indian subcontinent? And we have 1.5 billion refugees. That has economic consequences, as does water crisis, energy price shock, biodiversity loss, etc., all directly associated with climate change. I've just updated it for 2018 there, just so you know that I wasn't cherry picking the 2016 report as being the most important. The largest investors in the world are taking notice and are seeking assurances from the companies in which they invest that they understand how climate change impacts on business strategy and business performance. Not only that, credit ratings agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, are re-rating all sub-national government credit ratings at the moment, because they are concerned that they haven't adequately factored in the vulnerability to climate change into their credit ratings. And as you would all know, your credit rating determines how much it costs you to borrow. So, as our prudential regulator has said, this is nothing to do with the environment anymore. Action on climate change is a commercial imperative that is being driven by the weight of money. There is some good news as well. Lots of opportunities for local governments who are on top of climate-related risk, particularly in your financing activities. So green bonds, so hot right now. green bonds. These are basically debt instruments where the proceeds are tied to a particular sustainability project, like, say, solar arrays, or public transport, or redoing your water or sewage infrastructure, or redoing your roads with forest services, that kind of thing. And there is a lot of guidance out there about how to go about issuing a green bond. Not only that, in Europe and Asia in particular, we're seeing a new kind of credit facility emerge where large borrowers, Danone there borrowed €2 million, for example, and Mapfre, the big Spanish insurance fund, €1.5 billion, where the banks involved in lending to these organisations are willing to adjust the margin, the interest rate payable every year, that's linked to whether or not sustainability targets have been hit by that company. We're calling it a green discount or brown penalty. If you miss the targets, you agree to pay more. And we're seeing that more and more in Europe and Asia in particular. Not only that, for local councils, huge opportunities in neighbourhood power purchasing agreements and solar arrays. And I've actually brought Susie and Jeremy Hill from our office in Adelaide who have been involved in a number of these projects if you're interested in them going forwards. Finally, if you on council fail to manage the physical and economic risk exposures related to climate change, you're opening yourselves up to liability consequences and significant consequences for your insurance. So, of course, it's planning approval litigation on steroids, this stuff. And we're already seeing it. We're seeing boundary adjustments and public resumption of land because areas that weren't in a flood zone are now well and truly in flood zones or under the high water line on the coast. We're seeing cases where a failure to adapt council-owned infrastructure or state-owned infrastructure causes damage to other people's property. And what do people do when their property is damaged or their nest eggs are threatened? They sue. They seek to blame someone else. It's human nature. So we're starting to see a huge amount of litigation emerge. Force majeure in major project contracts. What's force majeure? I know it's a bit early for French. This is the unforeseen events, get out of jail free for act of God clause that the lawyers chuck up the back of every contract that you have. As we saw with the blackouts over here in South Australia about 18 months ago, where the South Australian energy retailer refused to compensate 17,000 community members for their losses from having no access to power for 2 weeks. Now, they weren't saying, oh, those winds that were actually caused by the renewables that was so strong that bent the transmission lines in half, they weren't so extreme as to have been unforeseen. But the fact the wind was so strong that we couldn't get a repair crews out for a couple of days was unforeseeable. To which my initial response was, why else do you need repair crews? But it's indicative of the fact that we need to re-look at the way that we approach risk allocation and management in all of your contracting. Because the universe of what is unforeseeable is now so small. And that is going to expose you to consequences. Not only that, in the corporate sector, we are seeing a significant amount of litigation for misleading disclosure. As climate change becomes a financial risk issue, if you mislead the market about how that risk impacts on your corporate performance, position, or prospects, you can be sued. And similarly, in the discharge of your duties under the Corporations Act and for you under the Local Government Act. And be aware that there are activist litigators out there who are filing lots of cases. So in short, the legal imperative for you to be managing climate change is clear. It's a legal imperative because you have specific obligations under the Local Government Act to exercise due care and diligence.
and to manage finances prudently. So you need to consider these risks across the entire spectrum of the council's portfolio. And the key issue for you is to think about stress testing and scenario analysis. How robust are our processes? Are we just taking a business as usual central base case when we're making decisions? Or are we looking across the spectrum of the potential climate futures so we get an understanding of that spectrum of risk in the face of uncertainty? Also, implications for your insurances. As we know, there's a widening gap between natural disaster damage and private insurances. That has the potential to flow through to mortgage defaults and property prices within your constituencies. What does it mean for financial lines of insurance, your directors and officers insurance? And as we know, where people suffer loss, they look for someone to blame, and if they're not insured, or they can't be insured, they look to the government as the insurer of last resort. If you need guidance, I would commend this report to you. It is the recommendations of the G20 Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It was commissioned by the G20 Financial Stability Board after Paris was signed. It's a framework of voluntary standards around the disclosure and therefore working backwards the assessment and governance of climate-related financial risks. Now, it doesn't deal with government specifically, but if you look at the sectors that it does deal with, from development to infrastructure, it's basically everything that the government is involved with. And stress testing and scenario planning are central themes of that report, and it will talk you through how you should go about doing these things. Now, these are voluntary standards, but I call them voluntary, because this is financial markets saying this is what we think needs to be done in order to tell us what is going on. And they are already being applied by $30 trillion worth of investor money out there, which is a third of the global capital markets. So, in short, the key messages for you today: climate change isn't an environmental lefty hippie greeny socialist thing. It's a financial risk issue. Doesn't matter what you believe or what any of your councillors believe about the science, markets are responding. And so it becomes a financial risk issue. And it's the legal and financial imperatives that drive your need to act. And you won't be an island when you do that. Cities and local government areas all over the world are already responding really proactively and vigorously. So that's all from me this morning. If you have any more questions, not too far. I feel like the Wiggles, the end's coming. I will, of course, be around after the session, more than happy to take any questions. If you have any questions about renewable energy or the specifics under your Local Government Act, I do have Jeremy and Susie here as well, who will be able to help you with those. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite John Nairn to the stage. John is the State Manager for the Bureau of Meteorology here in South Australia. He has an MBA, a DipEd, and a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology and Oceanography, and is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Since joining the Bureau in 1980, John has pursued many client-focused deployments. He's also been responsible for extending the Bureau's South Australian services to include embedded fire and emergency services, and targeted briefings for industry, including for the energy and the wine sectors, both of which are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. John has a particular passion for heat waves and was the recipient of a Churchill Fellowship on heat waves in 2013, building strong international and national partnerships. He's used what he learned to inform the development of the Bureau's National Heatwave Service and is collaborating with international heatwave service partners. And somewhere in amongst all of that, he's also undertaking a part-time PhD on heatwaves. Please join me in welcoming John Nairn.
Good morning. I confess I'm not in my best form today. I actually stayed up a bit late last night, fixing a figure for a paper that went off last night, so I got it right. Look, for those that need a PowerPoint, there it is. I've got a few sheets here and I can send it to you later. But look, it just shows the hockey stick, so you can actually see the rising temperatures in the oceans rather than the atmosphere. And the oceans themselves have also increased by 1 degree C. Now the thing about having the oceans, and that's the sea level rise, the green one next to it. The thing about having the sea temperatures increase by 1 degree is that it takes a lot of energy to get the oceans to move. So, to be honest, those other academics in the news media who care to write about climate change are distracting us by talking about the air temperature, because as scientists you'd appreciate, well, it just takes so much more energy to get the oceans to move. So it's all over. It's not a debate anymore. It's just good science that climate change is occurring. And maybe even just a pause for a moment, because of my Churchill Fellowship. I have some very good friends in the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and I've learnt a few things about some of the things that we've been seeing in displacements around the world. The Ebola outbreaks we're seeing increasingly return, they're climate change. The people are being displaced and they're moving closer into the forests where they get more of the monkey meat than they used to. And so, in fact, they're actually getting more exposure to that virus, and so the Ebola outbreaks are occurring more frequently. That's climate change. So is the Arab Spring, which of course led on to the Syrian war. So we're seeing climate change impact us now. And I've had the privilege of meeting Rear Admiral Chris Barry, who, along with other ex-Joint Chiefs of Staff, meet regularly around the world so they don't bump into each other badly by surprise. So China, America, UK, Canada, Australia, the ex-chiefs of staff meet frequently because they don't want to do something by accident, because climate change has actually shifted them together in an unanticipated manner. So why are we having trouble in Australia understanding climate change? It's because we live in one of the most variable climates in the world. Climates in Australia. So when I talk to people about climate, I say, look, on one hand I have climate variability, and that's something that Australia has an enormous amount of. On the other hand, I have climate change, and we're seeing a very strong warming signal. So it's very easy to be taken to pieces by people that see a sudden wet year and go, huh, or a cooler year, and say, nonsense, where's this climate signal? So 2016, the Indian Ocean went into a negative IOD. The tropical waters to our northwest became very warm, and over near Madagascar they became quite cool. That shifted the wind direction to actually push toward us, and that ended up picking up more moisture, and we actually got northwest cloud bands that continued to rain over us all through winter and spring, and we had a very wet, stormy outcome from that. So we understand the dipoles in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. We call the one in the Pacific Ocean the El Nino, the EMCEE, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And we're getting extremely good now at helping people understand the trends that they can anticipate for guiding their agricultural decisions, their energy decisions. Will I get enough wind to generate power at the right time of year? So we're actually a very well trusted organisation in terms of our short-term weather forecasting and seasonal forecasting, and indeed, as we put more investment into our numerical models and supercomputers, we're pushing out extreme weather forecasts to about 12 months. So that's something that we've got a lot of interest in. So understanding that variability, where you can push into a dry phase and it gets hotter like we're going up right now because we've got a weak El Nino starting up late, and we have a positive IOD, which is actually a drying signal. So our waters to the north of Australia are cooler. There's less moisture to be picked up, so we're actually getting a dry spell through us. And of course there's quite a nasty drought in the east. So really speaking, it's just a case of understanding that it's very easy to be distracted by the noisy birds in the media who are clearly protecting a carbon economy. The climate change signal is real. It is not slowing down. I'm collaborating with the UK Met Office and NOAA in the adoption of my heatwave, cold wave algorithm. It's sitting there in global models currently, and so I was monitoring the heat waves occurring across Northern Hemisphere, this last Northern Hemisphere summer. So the unprecedented heat waves of Norway, northwest Russia, China through Korea, no one talked about Korea, into Japan, and the Canadian, Alaskan, Canadian, and into North America heat waves. They are very present and real and repetitive events now. And so the Northern Hemisphere's over it. Even the US government, let's put aside the president and what's going on there, the American government's very active on climate change issues. And so they've got deep policy dealing with climate change because they recognise the risk. So, and look, I'd probably close with something that's probably a little bit closer to home. Fire seasons. I think in the course of my career, I've seen the fire seasons increase in activity by about 50%. So that's in 30 years of work. And so we're getting longer fire seasons, and that's certainly an expense on the community. And the reason why that is, just to close out, is that already our tropics are wider than they used to be. So as we came out into this last winter, we had nil effects from either ocean, so we're in neutral forcing from either ocean, both neutral. So in effect, that is the climate, no variability impacting us. So what happened to the rain? So the expanded tropics, it will contract as the winter approaches, and as it contracts, the westerlies will start to come in. So if you have a wider tropics than you used to have, it will take longer before you get the onset of winds. So for a very long time I was saying it was going to be late July before the rain started. Sure enough, I think it was pretty much August, and we had a pretty wet August, and that's all shut down again. So I do implore you to understand that climate change is real. It's here now. We have a wider tropics than we used to, and it'll just simply get stronger. Thank you.
Next up, we have Mark Siebentritt. Dr. Mark Siebentritt is a Director of EMCEE Consulting Services, where his focus is on climate change planning, natural resource management and regional development. He's worked on over 60 climate change projects and has a reputation for being able to work with communities to navigate through the complexities and potentially confronting social and economic issues relevant to climate change adaptation. Mark is well placed to be able to share with you some of the successes of councils in South Australia in working in climate change, and also some of the future opportunities. Please welcome Mark Siebentritt.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks for the opportunity to come and speak today. So I think what we've heard so far is that there's a challenging time that's ahead of us. However, with every challenge there's also opportunities, and I don't want to overstate the opportunities, but I think it's beholden upon us to look for what those opportunities are and how can the community, the government sector and also businesses work together on that. So I'm going to, Sarah, I'm trying to mimic your waving here. Here we go. Oh. So some of the graphics have disappeared from here, so it looks far less impressive than it did earlier today. So really what I want to do is touch on what are some of the things that are already happening locally, both within your region, so within Resilient South and also Resilient Hills and Coast, but also some of the things that I think are interesting from a South Australian perspective, which give us an indication of where we're going and the potential opportunities. Also then want to touch on what's happening internationally. So Sarah said, you know, people are on board internationally with climate change and the need to act for it. But it's interesting when you start to unpack what are the dollars that's actually being invested in climate action, and then how might Australian organisations, businesses, government get involved in some of that. So in terms of what's happening just in a broader context in South Australia, as you know, we've been through this process of developing regional adaptation plans. So Resilient South was one of the first cabs off the rank, and the Resilient Hills and Coast came along a few years later. And that's happened right around the state. And what that means is we have a very broad understanding of the type of climate impacts that are going to occur in the state, but also what we might need to be able to do for it, or do in response. Really the focus now is how do we move from that awareness into action? It's obviously not just enough now to have a good strategy and to be aware. We need to say, what are we actually doing on the ground? And so to me, when we look at this space of strategy to on-ground action, there are some really interesting things happening at the moment at a broader SA level. I think we've got Greening Adelaide, which is an initiative of the new state government, really interesting initiative about reinvesting really in our urban forests. It's going to be a fantastic opportunity to look at how you offset things like urban heat islands. We've got a really strong focus on coastal adaptation. Now, I know that your region has already done some work in this space, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But it's happening right around the state. So we've had communities like down at Southend in Wattle Range Council in south of the state. They've basically gone to their community with the data and said, this is what we think is going to happen with sea level rise. And they've now got a community caravan park where there is a decision to look at how you retreat that caravan park to a high location. So they've gone from a theoretical discussion around, well, what might happen at some stage in the future, and getting much more specific about the on-ground action that's going to need to occur. So plenty of examples going on around the state. In terms of energy transition, I know we've seen the windmills, we've heard about the Tesla battery, but to me one of the more interesting examples is something that's happening that's perhaps not as widely promoted and discussed. So SA Water, who is one of the state's largest energy users, they've made a commitment to move towards net zero electricity costs, so that's not emissions, it's net zero electricity costs, by 2020. We're not talking about 2030 or 2040. By 2020, SA Water doesn't want to spend any more money on its electricity. And the way they're doing that is they've made a commitment to invest in 152,000 kilowatts of solar. 152,000. Now, if we think of the average house, if you're driving through Adelaide, maybe it has a 5 or 6 kilowatt system, that's 30,000 households worth of solar panels that we look like that. South Australia Water have really seen what's an economic transition risk. They've recognised what's happening around energy prices, and they've made this commitment, and it's basically going to happen in the next couple of years. So it really is amazing at a national level, and when it was announced, there certainly was a lot of interest in it nationally. So once again, we've got the graphics missing here, so we've just got the bullet point list on the right-hand side. And look, there's a whole raft of things that are happening in the region, and we'll just list some of them off, and I'll focus on a couple in a little bit more detail. One of the things that we're seeing right around the state and in this region is an upgrade to LED street lighting. So that's good for cost savings, also good for reducing emissions. We're also seeing mapping of heat exposure in urban areas. So Resilient South was the first one in SA to really thoroughly at a regional scale undertake urban heat island mapping, so fixed wing aircraft, thermal cameras sitting below it, and to get an understanding of, well, where is heat accumulating in the region? It's interesting, there's a paper that's just come out in Nature recently, which suggests that 10% of the GDP of capital cities around the world by 2030 will be spent on managing the urban heat island effect. So when we think, oh, we've got some really interesting maps here for Resilient South, isn't it great? We can talk about it with people. They're actually really important practically because the science is suggesting we're going to be spending a lot more money in the future on how we manage the urban heat island. So that sort of work's been done. We've also got investing in urban green programs. And to my mind, where this all comes together is understanding where do we ultimately prioritise heat mitigation activities. Because the urban forest is a great way of mitigating urban heat. This is a bit of work from Monash Uni. So what they do is they look at saying, we know where the point intersects between heat exposure, social vulnerability and behavioural exposure. That's where we need to be putting our investment in terms of heat mitigation. And if we look at an area, floor bowls clubs, so they're the sorts of things that a lot of investment is going into at the moment. But what are we doing? We're turning living turf into artificial turf. And artificial turf is one of the hottest surface materials that exists in the urban landscape. So what we're actually doing in practice at the moment is going the exact opposite direction where we need to in terms of something like an area like a lawn bowls club. So there's plenty more to talk about in that regard. Let's come back one. Thanks, Jen. I think there's a delay going here. So the other sort of things that are going on there, community energy program. And I know Sarah's mentioned this, there's a lot of interest in this in South Australia. There's action happening, for example, through Resilient Hills and Coast in that regard. And a lot of it's building off experience that's happened in Victoria. We're seeing greater allocation of funding to looking at climate change as part of long-term financial plans. And also the Resilient Hills and Coast region has been engaging in discussion with Insurance Council Australia. The Insurance Council Australia is really very interested in climate change. And so they've actually looked at stumping up cash to contribute to a project in the Resilient Hills and Coast region to understand what's the housing archetype, so what are the different types of houses you have in the region, and then how exposed are they to different types of climate risk. So there's plenty of examples of things that are happening here locally in the region that are taking us down the path of starting to at least adapt to climate change. So that's around local opportunities and activities. Jen, that'd be great if you just press that button. Fantastic. So how big is the market? When you start to put some of the numbers together on the size of the market internationally around what I really call as climate change services or climate change solutions, the numbers are massive and they start to get mind-boggling. And look, I won't go through all of them at the moment, but we can see that one of the really interesting figures that comes out of this new economy report that's on the right-hand side there is that by 2030 we're about to, all the infrastructure that has ever been constructed and invested in on the planet, we're about to do that all over again by 2030. And if you look at places like the Asian Development Bank, so the Asian Development Bank develops or invests in critical infrastructure across the Asia Pacific region. They don't invest in a project unless it's had a climate risk assessment done. Now they're not a fringe, small organisation, they're investing $30 billion per year, and they have $6 billion a year that they invest in looking at climate action. So when we see massive amounts of money getting poured into infrastructure around the world and in the Asia Pacific region, we can see that a lot of this is actually requiring understanding of climate risk. So that touches on the development banks. And even in Australia, if you look at internationally, even though there might seem to be political debates around how we're dealing with climate change, we're actually investing significant amounts in some regions. So if you go into the Pacific, we're spending about $300 million on climate change and resilience in the Pacific. So that's a close neighbour, we're spending a lot of money over there. One of the interesting questions that then comes up is, well, where might be the emerging market opportunities? So if you're an Australian business, or even if you're looking at government, looking at encouraging business, we can start to unpack and try to understand, well, where might be the best market opportunities. So when I'm not with EMCEE, I'm also Director of Climate Change Services Australia, which is a not-for-profit organisation that's looking into really helping Australian organisations get more involved in international market opportunities. So what we did was engage a trade economics firm to have a look at this question of, well, where are the opportunities going to be for climate change services? And we look beyond China and India, which often gets a lot of the attention because of the big sums of money that are discussed there. But we really broke down relative competitive position for Australia and also the market attractiveness. But what it says is there are big opportunities in places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, and the Pacific region. So, while often we're looking at China and India from climate change solutions perspective, there really are some significant opportunities that are coming out in these countries here. And there's obviously some thinking analysis that sits behind it. In terms of what those opportunities are, critical infrastructure is going to be one of the big ones. It's around water, it's around energy, and it's around transport. And one of the ways to certainly encourage your region and other regions to look at this is to say, what are the responses that you are already taking to adapt to climate change where you're developing unique capability? And then how does that align with international market opportunities? And there's a great example of this already, and I'll just close on this. There's a great example of this already in South Australia. And we look at the stormwater treatment wetlands around Salisbury. It's a great example whereby we had an issue around managing stormwater, an issue around water security. And so in those Salisbury wetlands, we developed really an industry in South Australia who knew how to apply that technology. It turns out that there's international demand for it. And so now some of the organisations who were involved in developing that technology and approach in Salisbury are now in places like China with the Sponge Cities initiative, looking at how to roll it out internationally. So there are opportunities here in looking at how we respond to climate change, even though there are some risks as well. In this region, certainly on the path to taking serious action. Thanks, Nathan.
Last but not least, we have Donovan Burton. Donovan is a climate change specialist with a diverse portfolio experience. Over the past 13 years, Donovan has undertaken over 150 climate change adaptation projects, and he was recently recognised for his work when he was awarded the National Climate Change Adaptation Champion Award for his work on measuring climate change governance. Donovan has presented at United Nations conferences, and his work has also been presented at the World Economic Forum. Donovan is a scholar with the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, and he sees governance as a critical element in shifting organisations into a proactive space for climate change. Please join me in welcoming Donovan Burton.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks everyone for having me. I've come down from a rather wet Brisbane as well, when we've had some pretty significant dry weather lately, but it's pretty soggy there at the moment, so this feels like home. What I'm going to talk about, and I'll be quite brief, and I want to bring it home for everyone here who works in the local government and state agencies. And so I want to talk about the kind of cascading risks that I think we should be thinking about, and I'm just going to do this via some storytelling, and I'll give an example of what I call the spirulina drink that I was involved in a few years ago. I'll also talk about how the banks are about to start transferring the risk to local government. I think it's a really interesting space for you. And then we'll talk about governance. We'll bring it back together. I'm going to encourage you to keep your eye on the ball. I'll give you some examples of where some local governments have done some fantastic work, and I'll especially talk about the Whitsundays who have gone from zero to hero, as their mayor says. And then, of course, I'm going to talk, just very briefly, talk about the importance of keeping your eye on that, doing everything in a zero carbon space as well. So it's not just all about adaptation. So cascading financial risks, push the button one more time, thanks. So there's the spirulina drink I was talking to you about. So in 2014, I think it was around about August, I was in the city of Toledo, which is down there, and it's a population of about 500,000 people. Now, I was passing through, catching up with some friends, but I was on my way to a business meeting, and I was ironing my clothes, and I accidentally turned on the TV, and it was Fox News. It's always exciting. And this big warning came up, and it said, don't drink water, don't touch the water, don't shower in the water. Heavens above, don't boil the water because you're going to intensify the risk. Just don't go anywhere near water at the moment. So it was quite freaky, because there's 500,000 people in the city and there's probably about the average of 2 guns per person. But, I was trained as an environmental planner originally, so I always worked in planning, and I thought, how on earth can a city of 500,000 people overnight have no potable water? And when I left that day, which I'm glad that I did, they ran out of water for about 3 days, which they said was the maximum they could hold this. I did a bit of research, and I actually saw some interesting climate change signals there. So it starts off with, of course, the area's had some significant warming, especially in the winter months. And if you ignore some of these polar vortices, where some they've had some big winters also locked in, but on the whole, they've had a pretty significant amount of warming over the winter. So it's a phenomenal opportunity for the agricultural industry. So there's been a shift into another mega trend, industrialisation of agriculture. And so at the big regional scale, what's happened is that, we've had more agricultural activity. So you have an extra 12 days of agricultural activity at that industrialised scale, and so they're all digging up the land. But of course, because the winters were cooler, there were more pests, so that they had actually more invasive species, and so they had us do a lot more spray at that regional scale. And then combined with that, because it's mechanised sort of agriculture, they really damaged the soil, and they had some extreme weather that blew the soil, and the soil ran off into Lake Erie there, which is that area you can see in the middle with the algal growth. And then you combine that with the Lake Erie, where the runoff was going into. And Lake Erie is getting shallower because of climate change, more extreme weather, so it's getting shallower, it's getting more warmer, it's more conducive to blue-green algae. That was the scary part, that's the blue-green algae. There'd also been a change in the prevailing winds, and so where they had their water intake pipes, the algae had started to blow over the water intake pipes, and that's where their problems arise. And then the final straw in terms of climate change, the microsystem that was actually embedded within the blue-green algae is a new sort of microsystem that's come about because of climate change. That's a really toxic form of microalgae. And the interesting thing for a local government, and when I'm talking about financial risks, is that the City of Toledo have blown their budget to now plan for, this was in 2014, they now have to, heavily dive into their water treatment facilities. They're millions or tens of millions over budget in this space because they have to provide drinking water to 500,000 people. So what becomes one person's opportunities, so this is the farmers, the opportunities we talk about with climate change, actually becomes an organisational risk and a systems risk for local government. And this is why I talk about the importance of keeping your eye on the ball. And then we've got the banks. So the Commonwealth Bank last year had a class holder action against it, even with an injunction to stop them from releasing their annual plan. The shareholder action was saying, hey, look, you've got to consider climate change. So the class action was dropped last year. The bank said, yeah, fair enough. We've got this thing called the TCFD, which Sarah spoke about, which I think is actually driving more action in the world than politics. And if you click the next slide. So a few weeks ago, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the Commonwealth Bank came out with the annual report. About 8 pages of the annual report specifically talk about climate change risk, both from the transition risk and the mitigation risk, the greenhouse gas mitigation risk, but also the physical risks. And this is where the interplay between the banks and the local governments is going to be really, really interesting. So if you look at what they say they're going to do, and this is just the Commonwealth Bank, in the, I think it's the 2019-2020 financial year, they're saying, okay, well, yeah, we recognise there's a risk, give us a little bit of time. So what we're going to start doing is we're going to start looking at the climate change risk when people apply for loans. So, our plan in the next 2 years is to map out what we should be doing. So for business loans, for agricultural loans, and for residential property loans, we're going to start looking at climate change risks. I've worked in neighbourhoods where the whole entire neighbourhood cannot get any more than 70% loan to asset ratio. And what that does when you're sending signals to the market, that says, okay, well, no first home buyers are welcome here, because which first home buyer can find 30% of a property in cash, especially for somewhere like Auckland, where I'm from, we're looking at $300,000. And then for local governments, and it depends on what state you're in and how you actually do your rates, but I know that your rates are somewhat pegged to property values here. And if you get the increase in infrastructure spend that you are going to get without a shadow of a doubt, but a decrease in property values in some places, so if you're actually at in a high risk location, and if you had been just focusing too much on what maybe your elected members were saying and allowing property development to go in some silly places, what you're going to get is a change between your loan to dollar value, or rate to dollar value as you call it down here, is going to go up, but the property values are going to go down, and that's going to be really interesting. So some people are going to go, hey, how come my property rates have gone up from $1,200 a year to $1,500 a year, but my property's lost, $30,000 in value. So you can have an interesting dynamic to play, in terms of managing your political risk. Next slide, thanks. So to bring that all together as governance, next slide, please. So most local governments in Australia, so I've done the climate change, what I won the award for, it did climate change governance assessment for approximately 250 local governments in the country. So everyone in Queensland, everyone in Victoria, and also in Tasmania, as well as all the state agencies and state-owned corporations in Queensland and in Victoria. And the interesting thing, this top slide here, and I won't tell you what local government that is, they've scored an advanced score in doing adaptation planning. So some people think, oh, well, I'll do an adaptation plan, and that's significant enough to be showing that I'm doing my work. But, what we need is this climate action, as Mark so rightly called it, and that's where I'd say governance is important. So when I'm talking about governance, local governments, you have governance arrangements. You often have some pretty good governance arrangements, better than the states, may I add, because you're ultimately a function of the state. You don't have constitutional recognition, so they've told you how you must make your decisions. And so, you have some form of in Australia, a council plan or a corporate plan. I think you call it the strategic management framework or something like that. Yeah, financial management plans, risk registers, asset management, land use planning. These are all the sort of things that local governments do on a day-to-day basis. And so what I do is I come through and I look at that climate change lens of where the consideration of climate change is in that space. And ultimately, I say the first thing you should be looking at, not is, have you done an adaptation plan, but have you enabled your organisation to actually manifest change? And so, of course, it has to be in your version of council plan. That's fundamental, because that's how you'll discharge your responsibilities under the Act. And so that's real fundamental. Thanks. I'll give you some examples. This is just a slide of Victoria. I think this one's actually for asset management plans. And, five local governments in Victoria scored an advanced score on the system that we had. So that was actually pretty good. In Queensland, I think there's only 3 local governments that have an advanced consideration of climate change and asset management planning. And things like financial management planning around Australia, there's 2 or 3 local governments in each state, and that's about it. If you're lucky, no one's got an advanced score, but they get into high. The reason why I do it at the state level or the regional level at least is it's not about pointing the finger at people, but it's about enabling a community of practice. Local governments are so good at sharing information off each other. That's what you do. You always do that. So what I do here is just enable that process. So the Victorian government, who funded this project where we looked at every local government, they then rolled out a community of practice leadership forum where the councils who scored high in advance did a presentation to all the other local governments to say, hey, this is how I got there. Just the next slide, please. And then if you look at doing it, without carbon, of course, which I think is fundamental, one of the interesting things in the assessment is that 30% of local governments in Victoria have committed to 0 net emissions by 2050 or before. And that's fundamental. That's amazing. I haven't seen that in any other state in the world, to be honest. It's 30%. I don't know what the percentage is here in South Australia, but I think it would be a little bit less. Next slide, thanks. The Local Government Association of Queensland, together with the Queensland Government, have done the same. What they've done is they've taken the results and then they've actually gone in to do detailed assessments with these local governments, and they're working with them. They're setting up community practice and knowledge portals. But interestingly, they're using the information from these detailed governance assessments to feed into their questionnaires from the reinsurance industry when they actually end up going to London to try and get their reinsurance, because they're saying, hey, look, we've got our eye on the ball here. You keep on asking us, what are we doing around climate change? And you keep on talking about the sovereign risk. And so what they're saying is, look, we're not perfect, but each year we are changing. Next slide, please. I just want to give a good example of what it really takes, because people say, well, what should I do? What's the best process? Ultimately, it's the people in the room here. Ultimately, it comes down to leadership. Ultimately, it comes down to some brave steps and, just bidding egos on the line or whatever it is, or, concerns around job security. But nothing will change unless there is leadership. And a good example is Whitsunday Regional Council. So 2 years ago, I did my governance assessment, and they scored 0. Absolutely, it was like flatline, 0 on every single indicator. And then when I presented back to the local government and the senior executives, I got a phone call 2 days later and said, look, we've had a bit of a meeting. We want to go from 0 to hero. What is it going to take for us to go from 0 to hero in this space? And they've already leaped a long way ahead. A few weeks ago, they opened up the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub. And on their technical advisory panel, they've got people like Tom Wigley, who's I'm sure John would know who Tom Wigley is, a revered scientist in terms of the climate science. But they also have people flying from Singapore, from Munich Re, to sit on their advisory panel 4 times a year. They have a representative from QBE sitting on the panel. They have people from James Cook University, Griffith University, IPCC lead authors. They have the Cane Growers Association, the UDIA. Instantly, all of these groups have come together with the local government, and they're not punishing them for making this market signal. They're saying, you know what, this is really interesting. We want to come, we want to work with you. Here's some money. And they're all getting together. And now, already the local government's generated enough money to hire 2 staff to look at this issue. They're going to support students as they come through. And they're really getting a good buzz in that space. This is my second to last slide. This is just going back to that local government bank intersection that I kind of wanted to summarise and talk about keeping your eye on the ball in this space. So number one is, you've got current versus future exposure, and it's hard for local governments because I've worked with so many of you, and that was my original thesis a long time ago, and I even worked in local government before it just became frustrating. But the interesting thing is, it's very difficult for past development approvals, what you've already done. That's going to be really challenging. But you can go a long way around future exposure. So fundamental, first thing you need to do is don't increase your exposure. Make sure you include climate change, whether it be in heat mapping, whether it be in sea level rise or extreme weather. Regardless of what your state government will say in terms of sea level rise, for example, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, for their high-end scenario, are using 1.1 metres of sea level rise. So that's where the market is looking at in terms of extreme risk. Asset management, of course, you need to do proactive measures to support a low-carbon, climate-resilient community. Explore public-private partnership opportunities. There's a phenomenal number around. As Sarah was talking about, the TCFD is actually forcing the hand of those in the private sector to become active participants in this climate change game. And if you're not at the table, as they say in these board meetings, you're on the menu. So you need to engage with the private sector. And ultimately, governance. There's nothing wrong with having a 0 score. There's nothing wrong with having a score, that's got a few bits and bobs. What you want to do is send a signal to the market to say that you are changing. You've got your eye on the ball, and it's going to take a process. But that's the most fundamental thing. 0 is okay as long as you've got a pathway to get out of that. And I'll just, there we go. I'll just summarise by saying, it's the direct and cascading impacts that are going to affect your bottom dollar. The direct ones, it's easier to predict because you go, more extreme events are going to affect our assets. But it's those cascading events like the City of Toledo or what the Commonwealth Bank are going to do. They're the ones that are really, really difficult to understand, and that's why you need to have it in your governance arrangement so you're constantly navel-gazing. You don't have to respond straight away, but you've got the mechanism to respond straight away. You're not going to cause maladaptation. As I said before, importantly, protect your property values. That's protecting your income stream. That's your income stream. So you don't want them to drop while the cost of service delivery is going to increase. It's really important to keep your eye on the ball there. And as I said, I just want to reiterate that I think climate change governance is a proven way to do that. It's already shaped a lot of local governments in Australia. I'll leave the next slide I think has my contact details on it. There you go. So please reach out at Twitter. I'm at Climate Planning. I'll be here all day. Happy to chat to anybody. So all the best. Thanks.
I guess from City of Onkparinga point of view, I'm Philomena, I'm Director of Community Relations, and our strategy area sits under my directorate, and also our environmental responses do sit under my directorate as well. So whilst we have had a long history, and I think have been leaders in this space in South Australia through our adaptation plans and heat mapping and responses to what's coming. I actually found that quite terrifying. The whole session was quite terrifying on a number of levels. And to be perfectly honest, bearing in mind all of what you've said, I actually don't know if our response is enough now. I don't know that we have brought it all together in a cohesive way around our strategic response and our governance response and our financial management response and our asset management response. I just don't know that we've done it in that kind of whole of organisation way. So that's something that I know I want to go back and have a look at. So I haven't actually got a question, but I've got lots of questions in my own mind for our own organisation about what we are doing and whether we're doing enough and what we need to do about that. But also because we've got a new chamber, a new elected member body coming on board in November. What do we need to do with them? Because they are part of the leadership. What do we need to do to make sure that they actually have an understanding and can also provide some leadership, both for the organisation but across the community, about the importance of this and what we need to do. So that's what's in my head at the moment.
Yeah.
So thank you. It's raised
Any
awareness.
response from Adam to that?
I could say this much. What's really interesting is, of course, the agricultural sector is the one that's always in the news about being impacted by climate change. And only very recently we've actually had, as part of one of those drought funds come up, the Bureau has been asked to supply information repackaged so that it's more accessible to people so they can understand it better. So don't think you can't come to us and ask us to help you, because the information can be confronting. And we have the world's worst website. It's put together by fellow heads, right? We love what we had and we put it out there. We're being worked over right now by professionals to get it in better shape. But it feels uncomfortable, so it must be working. But so the thing is, we do have the capacity to actually respond to requests to make information more accessible. It's the public, it's your organisation, really. Just have to ask us, and we can try and work with you.
To pick up on John's comments and also Nina's comments there, when I deal with local governments, I do get a sense that there is a lot of fear about uncovering what the reality is within your context. You don't want to scare people. You don't want to put bad news out there because you get sued or what have you. By ignoring the information, you're actually putting yourselves at much greater risk because there will be a far greater degree of maladaptation. And no one is going to thank you for that. Secondly, if you don't do it, others will do it on you or for you. So we have this whole new concept around hostile analytics on climate change, where the banks and the insurance companies, they don't need your help to do the assessments and the planning in order for them to understand what their risk exposures are. Some of the slides that Donovan did put up from the Commonwealth Bank annual report, they have looked at every single property in their 2 million property mortgage portfolio and assessed it for an increase in 5 climate hazards: bushfire, inundation, inland flood, soil contraction was the big one from the drying soils, what that means for foundations, and floodings. And they've published that in aggregate form. So if you're not doing it for your constituents and helping that transition to be as efficient and as managed as possible, you will find that others are forcing you to do it in a way that isn't so convenient.
That's going to be a people.
I probably don't need the microphone. Question. Really good discussion, I think, around, and the important one for local government is sending signals to market about the appetite for change and the now being changed. So Peter Weiss from Adelaide Hills Council, we've obviously had a lot of interest and a lot of work, and a lot of planning, and all of those wonderful things that government does really well, happening for some years. We took a really positive step this year. We did a significant long-term financial plan review. We've got a couple of million under climate adaptation and climate change under our functional strategies approach. I think that's the first real, tangible, strong market signal we've provided, which I'm proud of, but aware how limited it is. What do you think are the most immediate actions we can do to trigger further market signals and get the response that we need to actually make a bigger change?
Well, I mean, I'll go back to that governance thing because I think that's actually really important. I think that, yeah, you've got a couple of $1 million, right? At the moment in New York City, the cost of a seawall is $10 million a metre. $10 million a metre. Townsville Council did their assessment of how much is it's going to cost to fix their CBD, risk from climate change, is about $130 million. They had $2 million. So I think thanks. I'm a bit fuzzy. See how the other thing is, I think I was being louder. What you need to do is how can you leverage that money? So in terms of leveraging that money, how can you show the market that you're putting it into your system? So how can you ensure that you don't have that political risk? So you might say, look, we've put money into climate change, but then you just proved a big property development with 500, units down the road because the elected members don't get the issue, or because it's different in different councils, or it might be, it's not recognised in your asset management plan, because you haven't got a consistent way of decision making. So it doesn't take much. It definitely wouldn't take. It doesn't take much to get it mainstreamed into your organisation. At least start to. I think it's a really important one. And then the next one is ask the private sector, have a workshop. Say, hey, look, let's look at public-private partnerships. What is it, around maybe transferable development rights? There's all sorts of things out there, all sorts of mechanisms. You need to have that conversation with the private sector.
Now, we're at time, but I know that people still want to keep this conversation going. So feel free to get up and go if you have to, and we're just going to extend the conversation for another 5 minutes. Mark.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to add on is how we have hard discussions. And it's not just amongst elected members and within council, it's with the community. And I know you're in Adelaide Hills Council, so bushfire is probably a good example, but have a look along the coast. Understanding the impacts of sea level rise and having that hard discussion with the community is really important. So we're going beyond our general awareness raising around what sea level rise may occur to a certain degree to now coastal hazard mapping. So in an area like Nepean Bay, where we're doing a project at the moment, so Kangaroo Island Council, part of Resilient Hills and Coasts, you've got maps now that show by 2050 Nepean Bay, under certain storm surge events, it gets completely flooded out. So that's a very hard discussion to have with that community. We've gone from saying, hey, look, sea level rise that might impact you, to now maps where people can see that their property is on the wrong side of the map. And they start to say, should I be living here? I was about to go spend more money on my house. Should I be doing that? But that's a discussion we need to bring on. And so I think we've gone from people like me trying to run workshops where you try to have a bit of fun, we talk about raising awareness, but we're now getting to the point of having really hard discussions and people needing to think, well, what does it actually mean for where I live and how I choose to build a property? And I think that coastal example applies equally well in sort of like Adelaide Hills.
With all of this, there's a lot of doom and gloom, and there's a lot of opportunity. But I think we need to focus as well on the tambourines. We've got the sticks, we've got the carrots, but we also need the tambourines, where we actually really celebrate proactively the benefits of taking action like this. So talk to your banks, talk to your insurers about, okay, well, in our community, we've got farmers who are taking action in relation to climate change. What margin adjustments are available to support them? What can we do? Because you're leaving money on the table. If you have a sustainability plan and you are not leveraging that with your bank, you are leaving money on the table. And then talk about that and celebrate that and talk to your stakeholders, talk to, at state level, the roads departments and the forestry departments, because you're not an island, and everyone interacts and is interdependent with action on this.
Mark Salmer, I'm Director of Development and Reader Services at Adelaide Hills. My key question revolves around the fact that local government generally is under a lot of pressure to deliver more with less. And at the end of the day, what we're talking about is a long-term strategy, but we need to invest in it. So my question is, how do we convince the community to spend money on something they're not actually going to tangibly see for a long time?
So partly, you're also playing the mid to long game yourself. So it's the tambourines, it's that marketing of the issue. When I talk about putting it into governance arrangements, often you don't even have to have much outlay at all. So for the next few years, you might not be doing the outlay. What you're doing is you're setting up a system, safety development, pressures, that if the community know that if they have a climate resilient development, if the community know that, even if it's a new development, if they know it's going to be climate resilient, and you can show them that the Commonwealth Bank are already saying that they're going to, potentially affect their property value or their loan to asset ratio, then that's a good way to sell it, because what you're doing is you're saying, look, we're putting a bit of pressure on you. Yes, it's going to cost a little bit more in infrastructure charging, but a stitch in 9, saves time, or saves 10. For every dollar you spend in resilience, it will save you at least 10-fold that. And so, if you can at least show that, and you have a good communication strategy that says, this is why we're doing it. It's not because of us. It's so you can be insured audited, so that you can retain, that your property value. Because ultimately, for most mums and dads, a home is the one thing that often is our only asset. And so I think that's what you do. You argue the future proofing and why you're doing it.
Thank you all for your amazing attention and contribution to the conversation. I think we're all going to be going back and having a lot to think about. And I just remind you have a really great, effective network already set up across the 10 councils represented here today. Resilient South, Resilient Hills and Coasts. We have really strong existing working relationships and a strong track record. So draw on us to help you in thinking about how we sort our governance out. And I really want to reiterate that, the IPCC report says we must act now, and that the biggest thing we can do to reduce our risk is to stop emissions. So we really must make that our primary focus, in addition to the important work around governance. So please put your hands together one more time for our meeting.